So what are the major influences in EFT, and given those influences in EFT development, what would you say have been the major changes to this model?
Yeah, so there's, I think, two questions. What were the original influences, right? Where did it come from, right? And then what influences has it picked up along the way, kind of like a snowball rolling down into a hill or something. So, of course, in the person-centered approach, in the 1960s, there was a great divide between those who had worked with Carl Rogers in the counseling center in the 1950s and who had come to emphasize the therapist-offered conditions, so that we're focused on the therapist's contribution. And then in the late 50s and early 60s, Rogers and Gendlin and others began to look at the client process. What does the client do? Because they hadn't really looked at that before then. And so they started looking at what the client did. And they started differentiating. So, you know, the client experiencing scale came out of that. Then Laura Rice came and started talking about the evocative function and looking at the clients. And then, so there was a split that occurred in the 60s. And so we had two branches, the what's called the classic or relational person-centered approach, and what came to be called experiential therapy, which is, you know, originally Gendlin and focusing, and then Rice and Greenberg and folks like me and other folks. Right? So that's the big split, right? Between folks who focus mostly on the therapist relational conditions and people who began to differentiate. Okay, so influences for EFT. So, of course, we're powerfully influenced by the relational conditions, warmth, empathy, genuineness. And then we took on board Gendlin's work, and then, you know, Rice looking at developing task analysis. Now, task analysis came out of cognitive science. So, you know, looking at how experts solve problems, Newell and Simon, and the fundamental insight was that clients are experts too. Clients have expertise, particularly if you catch clients actually resolving something, right? Then you can study what they did, and so cognitive science was another influence. And so then, you know, we went into the 70s and the 80s, and you know, contemporary work on emotion started to develop, and Greenberg and Safran in particular picked that up, modern emotion theory, and started elaborating it, and emotion research. So that became a big influence, starting in the mid-'80s. So that came in, and that eventually led to the therapy being relabeled as emotion-focused therapy. Along the way, of course, we also picked up an interest in attachment theory, and you know, so that's in the mix too. Although it's not a big part, and we don't write about it that much, but that's in there also. Contemporary influences.
And the dialectical constructivism?
Dialectical, yeah, sort of Piaget. Well, actually what happened with that was that one of Les Greenberg's teachers and one of Laura Rice's colleagues at York University in Toronto was one Pasquale Leone, who was a student of Piaget's. And so Pasquale Leone sort of extended Piaget's constructivism and into a sort of doctrine of that he called dialectical constructivism. And that's the other sort of basis of task analysis. So that's in there, certainly. Let's see, is there something else I'm leaving out you can remind me of?
No. Gestalt therapy?
Oh, yeah, so Gestalt, sorry, yes, okay, right, that's in there also, right. So
central.
Yeah, well, you know, Laura Rice was studying a task from client-centered therapy that she'd encountered in her own clients in Chicago in the 50s, called systematic evocative unfolding. And Les decided to go get Gestalt training to see if they could find something in that tradition that would be amenable to study. And so he went to a Gestalt training institute, and at some point he butted heads with them about the importance of the relationship, because he kept saying, you know, the relationships are important. And this was the 70s when basically we didn't want to encourage client dependency, right? We wanted clients to be self-supporting, and yeah. So the Gestalt folks in that era, it's changed since then. But Gestalt folks in that era were really allergic to things like therapists being nice to their clients, right? And being warm and empathic and things. And it's like the dark side of Fritz Perls. Anyway, so that's where I'm going with the story is that finally they said to him, the Gestalt trainers at the Institute said to Les, well, if you don't like how we do it, why don't you go start your own therapy? So anyway, right. The amusing thing, of course, is that, you know, today a lot of Gestalt therapists say that they do EFT. Right. Yeah, and I've got a Gestalt colleague in Scotland who's a wonderful Gestalt trained therapist. And she's seeing clients in my research, and she came to me this week and she said, I'm so afraid I'm messing up the therapy, you know, because I did this thing where I had the client enact attacking themselves, you know. And I said, you mean you worked with a self-interruption split and you had a two-chair enactment? She said, yeah. I said, fine, no problem, right? You know, what else? And she gave me something else. I said, oh, that's self-soothing, right? You know, so basically there is a huge amount of overlap between what we do and Gestalt, and we look at each other's therapy and we say, well, it looks like my therapy. The main difference from Gestalt is the theory, the use of the emotion theory, and the process differentiation and laying out the task. So I can tell my colleague what she's doing better than she can, because we've got this language for it. And she said, you know,
yeah. And so what would you say have been the major changes to this model over time, to EFT?
Yeah, let's see. When we started developing the therapy in 1985, it was really before the emotion theory was differentiated. So that got added, Greenberg and Safran, and then during the 90s that got sort of clarified and added. So the emotion theory got put in there, and that really helped us clarify our theoretical base. And the other thing we've done is we've added tasks. So when we started in 1985, we didn't have empty chair work formulated. We knew there was an empty chair task, but it hadn't been mapped yet. So that got done in the late 80s. And then we added, let's see what we added. We added narrative work, and we added meaning creation, but the most recent one we've added is self-soothing. So we've just mapped the self-soothing task. All of us have been doing it for years, but we've never had a map for it. So now we've got a formulation of the markers and the stages and things like that. So basically what's happened is
on your blog?
You saw it on my blog, right? Yeah. Just you posted there a couple of weeks ago, right? And so part of what happens is we keep adding tasks.
Okay.
Right. So we're up to I think 14 now.
That's good. So how much is contemporary psychotherapy evolution somehow being influenced by EFT practices and theorizing, and if it is, to what extent is this recognized?
Yeah, I mean that's interesting. It could be an occasion for me to complain about how people don't recognize our work more, but what's really captured my interest in the last month or so is the influence of EFT on psychodynamic therapy. And
tell me about it.
Yeah, so the work of Diana Fosha, Lee McCullough, and Hannah Levinson. And these are three contemporary psychodynamic therapists who practice in an emotion-focused way. And
recognizing it?
Yes. In different ways. Hannah Levinson, for example, has stopped using transference interpretations and has replaced that with chair work.
Very interesting.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting thing, right? Yeah, and I think that's fascinating. So my group in Strathclyde and we started getting these videos of these contemporary psychodynamic therapists and looking at their work, and actually we're really impressed with them. Like Diana Foch is a wonderful therapist.
You could look inside. What a privilege.
Yeah. So that's a place that's been recognized. Now there's overlaps with CBT, schema therapy, And there's various kinds of CBT that are actually fairly close, and it's a little hard to tell whether where Jeff Young got his use of chair work and the schema-focused therapy, or it's just a little hard to tell. But
It's hard to tell.
Yeah. I mean, Aaron Beck now says that he never said that the relationship between cognition and emotion was only one way. Right?
Okay.
He says he always said it was two ways, right?
Okay.
Of course. Yeah. So is that influence? It's not recognition, but yeah.
It's a strange way of recognition.
Yeah. There's an interesting story that Les tells about Laura Rice, and that's that Aaron Beck approached Laura Rice in I think it must have been the early 70s, and asked her if she wanted to work with him, and she said no, thank you. Right. Yeah, but it's just interesting, right?
Mm-hmm. So, looking into this evolution, what would you like to see in EFT in the coming years as an evolution? How is the future?
Well, I'd like to see us, of course, doing more training with more therapists. I'd like to see us developing ways of working with new client groups. Right now we've got a pretty good, solid empirical evidence base for working with depression, with post-trauma, and with couples. Those are really solid. But what we haven't done much with so far is anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to see us, and we're starting to do the work now. I'm working with social anxiety, and the folks people in Ireland and Toronto are working with generalized anxiety disorder difficulties. So moving into anxiety, and that will stretch us and help us grow as EFT therapists. Eating disorders. Les's group in Toronto, we're working with eating disorders now, and that's a really interesting and important area to develop. So I'd like to see us expanding into other client groups and populations, and as we do that, we'll both learn how to work better, more effectively with those client groups, but we'll also develop the therapy further. It'll push us. So that's certainly, and that'll lead us to developing more tasks. So one of the reasons why we formulated self-soothing now is because we're working with these clients with social anxiety who live in this collapsed state. They just, their critic is so severe that they just get into this collapsed state and you can't somehow recover from it. And then self-soothing process turns out to be really important in therapy. So the client group has led us to develop the therapy more. I'd also like to see the humanistic therapies to be recognized more. I think they've got really, the humanistic therapies in general have really strong evidence base that's not recognized in the field. And I'd like to see us doing more research and being more political, actually, about how we use our research evidence so that we can be recognized for what we do.
Yes, okay.
The last book from Sandra Paivio and Pasquale Leone, complex trauma and EFT.
That's right. Yeah.
It's a new development.
But it's work that's gone back into the early '90s, actually. But they were able to put it together, I think, finally. I haven't even got my copy of it yet. It just was published this month. I don't even know.
On January.
Okay, right. Yeah. No, so I'm waiting eagerly to see that. But I've been following the work of Sandra Paivio on working with trauma, child sexual abuse. Most is what she works with. Been following that work for years. I think it's fascinating and important. As part of it, this is what's led to this establishment, this evidence base for the effectiveness of EFT with post-trauma. Unfortunately, not PTSD. In these studies, they don't diagnose. They don't diagnose PTSD. They just work with people who've got difficulties with having been traumatized as kids.
Okay.
Yeah.